Hi everyone, this is the opening video for the current module, which is on ethics and African philosophy, module 10. And so I just wanted to make a few comments as we go into this. I want to keep this fairly brief because as usual you have plenty of things to look at here. And the things you have to look at include a number of readings from our text. And in this particular module, I would like to actually look at those fairly directly in the content of the module itself. You also, as usual, have a History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps episode, just one this time around, on communalism. There is also an interview or a conversation, one of my conversation series, this time with Dr. Edwin Etiebo, who is at Wits, which is University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa, in Johannesburg. And we talked quite a lot about ethics there. So, you know, I mean, it's worth thinking a little bit about how this discussion about ethics fits into what we've been doing already in this course. As you know, I've started off this course trying to get you to think about how we can, to the best of our ability, think from an African point of view and not simply take a set of Western frameworks or concepts into an African space and just look for some sort of correlates or equivalent ideas or something like that. And that's especially the case, I think, when we think about ethics, because it's very easy to think about ethics as a singular sort of thing that means basically the same thing everywhere in the world. It's about how you act, it's about what good action amounts to, and how you justify what constitutes good action or what constitutes bad action. And so we all think that we have a pretty good idea of what we mean when we talk about ethics. And so it feels a little bit like it's going to be, you know, just a matter of looking within African societies to think about, you know, what local or what, you know, cultural content they have that kind of colors ethics. And if you think about it, certainly within the West, there's been a discussion about ethics, at least within the modern era, which draws back from all of that. I mean, you have people like Immanuel Kant, who proposes, you know, a kind of deontological ethics. And if you haven't taken an ethics course, that word might not be familiar to you. But what he proposes is an ethics that is based on duty. Okay, and so how do we know what our duty is? What he does not mean by duty, duty to a state or to a monarch or even to a god. He is not interested in you know, defending some sort of notion of subservience. Rather, his idea of duty is to, you know, a universal principle, and in fact, what he gives us initially is part of what we think of as meta-ethics. In other words, it's a principle about principles, or it's a principle about how you can construct principles. It's what he calls the categorical imperative. And so his categorical imperative, you know, there's got a number of formulations or a number of ways to state it, but that includes things like, you know, always do that which you could will that becomes a universal law. Okay, so it sounds a little bit like the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but it's not quite. It's not really the same thing. You know, it's, you know, can you will something to become a universal law? In other words, can you advocate an action that you could say everyone should do it, not just you or not just somebody that you care about or something like that. So that's one formulation. Another formulation is treating people as ends rather than as means to an end. And all of these things are really formulated on the basis of a certain kind of individualism. That is, ethics is about how individuals act. It's founded on a certain version of liberalism, you know, that there are certain kind of capacities that individual humans have. And so to be truly human is to exercise those capacities. And so we, you know, in the West at least, we come at ethics with that set of assumptions, and that's by no means the only way you can think about ethics. We, you know, if you've taken an ethics course, you will know that there's also consequentialist ethics, perhaps most famously John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham and people like that, who think in terms of the utility of an action, in other words, maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain for the largest number. So it's not just doing that for yourself, it's doing it for the largest number of people. So that's an ethics based on outcomes rather than on duty. We often talk about what we know as virtue ethics, and that has in some ways a much older pedigree, and it has it focuses on a different aspect of ethics, whereas deontological ethics and consequentialist ethics focus on what you might think of as the right. In other words, what the right action to do is. Virtue ethics focuses on the good. In other words, what does it mean to be a good human being? What does it mean to have character? What does it mean to overall be good? And in some sense, the individual actions are left to themselves. A good person will do good actions. The real focus ought to be, what does it take to be a good person? And so this is often associated with Aristotle. It's certainly later on associated with people like Thomas Aquinas. And so there's an entirely different approach to thinking about how ethical life should look, much more about the development of who we are rather than making decisions about specific things, is this action the right action, or is that action the right action? So that's the framework that we come to ethics often in the West, outside of Africa. And so as we come to, an African discussion of ethics, I guess we have to, ask ourselves, what are the salient questions? What are the important questions to ask? Are they the same questions? Are they always the same questions? Are they sometimes different? Is there a different frame of reference? For example, do we necessarily start with some notion that ethics accrues to the individual? There's a great deal of discussion, and we have, the History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps episode on communalism. So what does it look like to think about ethics starting from a communal point of view? Often we have a kind of binary, especially when you come from outside of Africa, that there's the individual and there's the community. And in the West, we think about individuals first, and they add up to communities. They do things, make agreements, whatever, and those comprise communities. And the other way to think about that is to think about the community first, and individuals are in some sense derivative of those communities. And I think with African philosophy, we have to kind of set aside that binary, that it's one of those or the other of those. It's not that in Africa individuals take, a back seat or are, neglected or something like that. Individuals very much matter in both traditional settings and in contemporary philosophical settings. And so the real question is, I think, how do you think about entering into a world in which individual decisions always happen within a world that's already meaningful, within a world that's already constituted, right? In other words, we're not kind of computers or brains in a vat or something like that just make these decisions in a kind of abstract space. You may have all seen, memes about the trolley problem. You might have heard of that. There's this problem where, there's a trolley coming down the tracks, and there's a split, there's a junction. You are at the place where you can determine which way the thing goes, and the classic problem has it that on one track there's, I think, 5 people tied down, on the other track there's one person tied down, one very large person or something like that. And then the question is, what do you do? Do you make a decision for the trolley to go down one track or the other? Somebody's going to die. Maybe multiple people are going to die. So how do you decide that? And so in kind of Western, I think of it as abstract versions of ethics. That's the kind of problem that people get interested in. It's a very point in time question. It's a question that there's no discussion about how anything got to be that way in the first place. It's just, here you are, this slice in time, and now you have to make a decision, and what's the ethical thing to do? So is that really the model for the vast majority of ethics, or even all of ethics? Or do we have to think differently about what it means to act in a world where, yes, we have individual decisions, but those decisions are always made based on options that are presented to us, maybe by our community, maybe by science, maybe by the natural world, maybe by who knows what. In other words, we never just sit in that kind of isolated space and make those, isolated decisions. And so that's why I say I want to, set to the side the idea that we're going to find something that fits neatly into Western ethics as an alternative to, a deontological or consequentialist or even virtue ethics sort of strategy. Maybe there's something different going on because a different set of questions are being asked in the first place. In other words, we're not necessarily just talking about how do you make this decision so that you can defend it as the ethical decision in this isolated case, or even how do you determine what good character is, even though, as we're going to see, a number of writers talk quite a lot about character. And that's one place where they link things, between the individual and the community. What you're going to see in this module are a lot of questions, and when you get to the discussion area, as I did in a previous module, I'm not going to ask you another bunch of questions as prompts in the discussion area. I'm going to just direct you back to the module itself because there's so many questions that I raise in that context, and so I'd like you to get you to talking about the content of this particular module. But they are interesting questions if you think about it. I mean, if you take this notion that our individual choice is not abstracted but is always in a world that is already meaningful, where where we have a set of choices presented to us, and maybe also where we have a certain relationship to history, to tradition, to community. In Africa, some of those things are represented by ancestors. They may be represented by spirits or something like that. There may be other kinds of causal accounts of how things happen in the world, through things like witchcraft or something like that. So, as we saw in an earlier module, the question for me at least is, what work do those things do? I mean, quite apart from the question of are there really spirits, are there really witches, what kind of work do they do in helping Africans figure out philosophically the kind of world that they live in and how you make sense out of that? The tradition one is really interesting to me because so many of the ways we have of thinking about African philosophy rely on some notion of tradition or other. In other words, the implicit idea is that modernity has not served Africans well because, in part, that it is tied to colonialism. It's tied to European modes of production, extraction of resources from Africa, slavery, apartheid, all sorts of things like this. And so for many people, to think about ethics from an African point of view means to step outside of that history, maybe by stepping before it. And that's where tradition comes in, right? How does somebody access a tradition that is not tainted or is not inflected by those, structures that really were for the benefit of others, the benefit of colonizers, the benefit of people outside of Africa. And so, if you think about ethics from that point of view, the question becomes, what place does tradition play in ethics? Is it simply about following the tradition? In other words, is a good ethical system a system that relies heavily on traditional ideas? And can that kind of system stand up in a world where we have cell phones, where we have, internet banking, where we have, everything, under the sun that comes, with the modern world? I'm interested in what I call moral imagination. Often, or sometimes at least, we might think about ethical questions as ultimately being pretty binary sorts of questions. There's a right and there's a wrong. Moral imagination is the idea that in situations where we have ethical decisions to make, maybe what we have to do is figure out how to maximize the values of everyone involved to the greatest ability. So that would take some imagination, right? That would be to think about what kind of options we have at our disposal that gives everyone as much of what they want as possible. So in other words, that's not a good or evil, right or wrong kind of binary. It doesn't reduce to that. So is there that kind of thing within an African context? It's inevitable that we have to think about the effect of colonialism as well, and I've already brought that up, but how does that affect the kinds of ethics that may or may not be able to be done? If we have an ethics based on some notion of human flourishing, and people just aren't flourishing because of colonial and post-colonial structures. If we have a version of ethics that's something like a virtue ethics where, people strive for their best self, and yet, some of the descriptions we see about, indigenous life within Africa is extremely difficult, right? And not just economically, but, in so many other ways. What does ethical life look like under those circumstances? What does it mean to be an ethical person, or to put into place ethical procedures or ethical institutions or something like that? So much of this ends up coming back to questions around the notion of the community, however we're going to define that. And so at some point we probably will have to define that. What do we mean by a community? How extensible is it? In other words, if you imagine that your ethics is going to be based on something like a community, is that going to work when you have a community that is 1 million people? Some of the projections of the growth of cities have the largest cities in the world on the African continent by the end of this century. Up to 100 million people in Lagos, Kinshasa, Dar es Salaam, Nairobi. I mean, all of these places are projected to be absolutely huge. So what does it look like to be, to have an African approach to ethics when you're dealing with something of that size? Is the notion of community really something which requires knowledge of, at least if not the individuals you're dealing with, the families that they came from or where they came from, or something where there's some sort of recourse? If someone harms you or does something you don't like, there's a way of doing something about it. So there's these really, really hard questions, and made all the harder by, some things that we've seen in the recent past. For example, and I talk about this not in this video with Dr. Etiebo, but in a later one we're going to see, the Rwanda genocide, in which almost 1 million people are killed in the space of 100 days. And that included lawyers and judges and, a lot of the kind of people that form the kind of institutions of society in Rwanda. And so, clearly horrible ethical, violations of so many people, as well as legal and moral. I mean, every kind of violation you can imagine. And then the question becomes, can you rely on traditional African structures to find your way through that? Well, in that case, they looked at what they called Gacaca courts, which were kind of traditional community courts. When you don't have a legal system anymore modeled on the West, how do you find some sort of legal way of moving forward, especially in a country that was not divided geographically? In other words, it's not like the Hutu were in one region of the country and the Tutsi were in another region. Everyone was right beside everyone, right? It was just totally, evenly distributed, or almost evenly, not quite, but it was very, very, there's no homeland that you can point to. There's no way that people who had been had genocide directed at them can retreat to a specific place and rebuild their community. They have to figure out how to live side by side with the people whose families were the murderers of their family. Legal questions obviously, how do you deal with that legally, but how do you deal with it morally, right? How do you face somebody when you know that maybe not that long ago their family targeted your family for extermination? So, some of these things are really, really hard ethical questions, and I guess the question is, what are the resources within an African space to deal with these things? And so we have a number of writers here. We have, I've given you some content from Kwame Gyatso, in a encyclopedia article he wrote in which he talks about African words for ethics, and he goes through that. And we also have an excerpt by him in the book as well. And he makes a particular kind of argument for what ethical reasoning looks like or should look like in Africa. We have an article by Peter Coetzee, who's one of the editors of this book, of our textbook. He makes a case for what we can call particularism within morality within Africa. We have two articles actually by Kwasi Wiredu, who's a very important philosopher who passed away just a month or so ago. And so those two articles really propose another approach to leveraging the kind of traditional values of Africans in order to have a kind of a sense of morality that's not really reducible to the kinds of Western morality that I just discussed. And then we have an article by Mogobe Ramosa on Ubuntu, the ethics of Ubuntu. We're going to talk about Ubuntu in subsequent modules, but I'd like you to look at this as well because he really focuses on ethics in particular on this. How does Ubuntu give the basis for ethics? And I think he's got a very novel sort of way of thinking about that. And then Musambi Malongi Yamona, who talks about the kind of the relationship between an ethical order and an economic order. And more specifically, how you can be ethical within an economic order, right? So it's not a denial that we have and that we need an economic situation, but that there needs to be some checks and balances on it, and so there are some proposals here for how that might look. And in every one of these discussions, I have a ton of questions. And so what I'm hoping you do in the discussion area of this module is to pick up some of those questions, to read this stuff and think about it and think about how viable some of these things are, what you think. Are they extensible to outside of Africa? Because often we think about ethics as at the very least universalizable. What does it mean to think about the universal as a kind of something that we earn or an object of our activity in philosophy? So, do these African approaches give us a way of doing that kind of adds to our discourse about ethics in the rest of the world? And then I've just thrown in a few short videos that are on Ubuntu, and like I say, we're going to talk more about Ubuntu as time goes by in this course. It's just a really important and central kind of idea, but I thought I'd get you started here to, since Mogobe Ramosa brings it up, that we could think about how this concept is used, especially in South Africa where it's probably the most prominent, and and then think about what it has to do with ethics. So there's lots to do this week, so I hope you enjoy the conversation I had with Edwin Etiebo, and and think about ethics from an African point of view. There's plenty to chew on this week. So have fun, everyone.